We're going to begin our episodes by talking about the doctrine Lutherans understand to be the core of all theology, justification by faith. We need to talk about this before we deal with the specific content of the Book of Concord, because it is the foundation of the whole Book of Concord. The book doesn't exist without this doctrine as the catalyst. Everything that flows out of the Book of Concord is rooted in the doctrine of justification by faith, and specifically, Luther's understanding of that doctrine.
Our springboard into this conversation will be a book on the topic by Gerhard Forde, Justification by Faith, a Matter of Death and Life. Before we get started, it's helpful to note two things about the book. First, Forde's title should catch your attention because of the reverse direction of the death and life language. We'll talk about why that's significant later on. Second, in Forde's introduction, he talks about the study of this doctrine, and he uses a metaphor of an explosion and the resulting crater. This is something we'll come back to time and again in the series, so remember it because it's an important analogy.
So, Sarah, what you're saying is we're going to blow some things up in this course? Well, that may happen, figuratively speaking. But let's look at what Forde is talking about and the language he uses to describe things. Forde sets forth a distinction between two types of discourse, first-order discourse and second-order discourse. This is the difference between talking about a topic and actually delivering the content. As we work our way through these episodes, we will talk about the topics at hand. We'll be engaging in second-order discourse. And as Forde describes, that means we'll be analyzing the crater that followed the explosion.
Right. But while that's all fine and good, studying the Lutheran confessions can't remain there. As we study the documents, we hope there's an actual event, an explosion, so to speak, in the ears and lives of those who are interacting with the documents. You can look at something from high in the sky, 30,000 feet above the surface, or you can be down on the ground experiencing reality yourself.
Right. In this class, you'll experience both. We'll look at things from 30,000-foot perspective, and you'll find yourself also at times in a petri dish, wrestling with the same issues the people on the ground in the mid-1500s were wrestling with. So let's return to the topic at hand, justification by faith. What is it? And why was it central to the movement begun by Luther? What was Luther's understanding, and where did it come from? You want to explain, Sarah?
Sure. To be clear, Luther didn't just pull this out of thin air. His understanding was rooted in Scripture, and the specific passage is Romans 1:17. The righteous or just, dikaiosune in the Greek, will live by faith.
Okay, before we go any further, we need to unpack some language here. We just used a big word, and so we're going to turn it over to our vocabulary snob to talk about two words in this verse and how they are commonly understood.
Vocabulary snob, huh? Well, actually, fair enough. Let's start with the word justice or righteousness. In the Greek, it's dikaiosune. Righteousness in this context concerns your standing before God. Naturally, the question is, who or what makes you righteous or just before God? The answer is in another Greek word. What makes you righteous before God is your pistis, which is translated as faith. And this Greek word, pistis, can also be translated as trust or belief.
I think from now on, we won't call you a snob, we'll just call you a nerd. With that noted, let's return to Forde's book. In it, he identifies two ways the justification by faith language in Romans 1:17 has been interpreted. One is through the eyes of a moral, legal metaphor. Another is through the use of death to life image.
Let's take a look at the moral or legal metaphor first. Forde lays out this way of thinking about justification by faith language in Romans 1:17 and says that it results in understanding the word righteous or just in terms of the law, morality, justice. This is how Luther was raised. He was taught that God is a demander, a judge. The result of this understanding of righteousness is that you believe you get what you deserve, and you are what you do. This is the old scholastic way of understanding righteousness because it was rooted in the ancient philosophical understanding of virtue as something you practice. Aristotle's Ethics is the prime example of understanding justification by faith as a moral or legal metaphor.
Now, this change Luther instigated is what most people, especially Protestants, recognize as works righteousness. So, most people recognize that the scholastic understanding of doing something to become righteous is inherently wrong. But this doesn't mean that the doctrine of justification is totally removed from the legal scheme. In fact, amongst Protestants, including even some Lutherans, a second legalism sneaks in. This happens when we turn the doctrine of justification into something about which we need to have a correct understanding. You need to get your theology right, or something of the sort. So people will simply just say the right words or make it into a formula of some sort. Then, parroting the formula, having good theology is what makes you righteous. Again, this is its own form of legalism.
Yeah, and this is what we call Lutheran legalism. It's another ditch Lutherans fall prey to fairly regularly. In his book, Forde recognizes this as the most common approach to the Book of Concord and to the doctrine of justification by faith. Legal language has come to dominate the discussion of the confessional documents found in the Book of Concord. People will use it as a proof text, a gotcha moment, or something of the sort. Forde uses the imagery of capping an explosion and examining the crater left behind. So, Chris, why don't you describe how we remove the legalistic nature of justification by faith?
Sure. Remember, Forde set out a second way of approaching this, the death-to-life metaphor. Note, he also recognized that identifying this approach as a metaphor is not entirely accurate, because it is actually an event, not a matter of intellectual assent. It is what happened to Luther when he ran into Paul in Romans 1:17. He was killed and made alive, as he came to have revealed to him what 1:17 actually means. And this is the goal of this course, to duplicate the explosion, not simply to examine the crater.
Luther described his own experience in his preface to the Latin works. Having struggled with the legal metaphor, Luther says he broke through when he took seriously the context of the words of Paul. Luther put it this way: "And I extolled my sweetest word with a love as great as the hatred with which I had before hated the word righteousness of God." Thus, that place in Paul was for me truly the gate to paradise. Now note, Luther is saying he hated God when he believed him to be only a demander, a judge, part of a big legal system. But once he understood righteousness and justification in a different way, according to Scripture, he actually loved God, and he saw this as the gate to paradise. So Chris, explain something. How or why was it that Christians in Luther's time and Christians today have different ways of understanding justification by faith?
Sure. Answering this will help unpack what happened to Luther and how or why it happened. To be clear, Christians are all using the same Bible, and so all agree that righteous live by faith. Often I get asked, and you'll be asked this as well, what is the difference between what Roman Catholics believe, other Protestants, and Lutherans? It's an important question. So there's three different ways: Roman Catholic, Protestants coming out of Calvin, and Lutherans influenced by Luther. So let me give you an example of what I often tell people. On the last day, Judgment Day, Jesus will be standing there, and a Roman Catholic will show up, and Jesus will slam the gavel and say, "Sinner, guilty as charged. What do you plea?" A Roman Catholic says, "I have faith. Look at how good of a lover I was." Faith formed by love. A Protestant coming out of Calvin's influence will stand there. Jesus slams the gavel, says, "Sinner, guilty. What do you plea?" A Protestant under the influence of Calvin will say, "Look at how much faith I have, Jesus." Now a Lutheran, influenced by Luther, standing there, Jesus, again, slams the gavel, "Sinner, guilty, what do you plea?" The Lutheran says, "But you said so, Jesus." So, let me turn it back to you, Sarah. What is at the heart of the difference?
Well, let me pull out my word nerdiness here. The sticking point is a simple little Latin word Luther threw in there, sola, meaning alone. The sola, or alone, of justification by faith alone is the problem for Protestants and Roman Catholics alike. People want to set up justification as a legal process, becoming just by following the law, climbing the ladder, faith formed by love. Or we hedge on the sola by asking, don't we have to do something, demonstrate our faith, feel a certain way? But Luther recognized something very different was going on in all of Scripture. He saw it in Romans 1:17, in which Paul was quoting Habakkuk 2:4. Trust in the external promise alone is what broke through for Luther. This is coming right out of Scripture and Habakkuk 2:4 specifically, the righteous live by faith. The Israelites in Habakkuk's time knew they were not righteous in any sense of the word in terms of the law and in understanding God as a demander or a judge. But Habakkuk confessed faith. Faith in the God who is not a demander, but is a giver. And what he gives is his mercy, promise, all the way back to Genesis 3 and the promise that God would crush the serpent's head. This is why Habakkuk further confesses in 3:2, in wrath, he remembers mercy. Habakkuk knew they were experiencing God's wrath, but that wrath did not have the final word over them. God's mercy does.
Yeah, this is an important piece. At the heart of the death to life language is being honest about the actual death. And we'll talk more about this later, but we have it staring at us right here in the book of Habakkuk. What makes the explosion happen is being honest that God has wrath. It is through God's work and wrath that the Chaldeans run over the Israelites. It is God's wrath against sin that brings death into the lives of God's chosen ones. Death is an essential part of this equation. God's wrath is revealed in the death. So, the explosion is set off when we experience God's wrath personally. But then, as Habakkuk says, and Paul picks up in Romans 1:17, in the midst of that wrath, God's chosen elect are given faith while they are experiencing God's wrath. They believe God's promise despite what they are experiencing at the moment.
Okay, one last word nerd in this episode. What do we mean by faith, trust, belief? The word itself has been taken captive by legalism. It might mean really believing, really sincere, really heartfelt. This is a common misunderstanding of faith, thinking it's an active verb and thinking we are the subject. In other words, controlling it. Instead, faith is a state of being verb. Why don't you say a little more about what that means, Chris?
Sure. Here's how Forde talked about it. Faith is a state of being grasped by the unconditional claim and promise of the God who calls into being that which is from that which is not.
In the New Testament, and this is what Luther understood, faith means death and resurrection, and specifically, it means being killed by God and raised to new life. Justification by faith, then, is the death of the I. It is not simply a slogan, such as justification by faith alone. It is a function.
Right. It is death and resurrection, and this reality takes precedence over legal language. It is not a legal metaphor because under the legal metaphor, the subject does not die, but is a continuous existing subject who is merely altered by grace. The explosion Forde is talking about, and the explosion Luther experienced, is actually God killing you and giving you new life, faith in the here and now. This doesn't improve you or make you better. It gives you God himself.
So, like we said in the beginning, this class is not simply going to be reading and learning. As Luther once said, to be made into a theologian, one must live. No, rather one must die and be raised to new life. This is what makes one confess like a Lutheran.